So yeah, we're here with my friend Chris Adams in his backyard around some fruit trees that he helps to manage here, and yeah, we want to talk about the tradition of wassail. And so this time of year, normally here in Victoria, my family and I, we would go down to the Vic West Community Center, and they host the Morris dancers, and there's a big orchard kind of dance and some ceremony involved. But being a global pandemic and all, we're not necessarily able to do that this year. But I wanted to ask Chris, who has some familiarity with wassail, just to share some thoughts on your views on the tradition and some of the histories that you're aware of.
Well, and it's an important thing, so thank you for asking about that, because all too often in the hurriedness of trying to get things pruned and fruit picked and bottles of cider made, we forget about giving thanks for the gift that all of that fruit really is. And that's what ultimately wassailing is about. And there's quite a bit to it. It was something I had no idea about growing up in Victoria, surrounded by fruit trees, until I moved to Britain. And especially in the southwest, in places like Somerset, where, interestingly enough, many of my ancestors came from. And because these are peasant agricultural laborers, they weren't paid in cash, I came to learn. They were actually paid for their work in cider. So cider was the basis of the economy and life. And so it was very important for the trees that those people were tending to produce. And so they did whatever they could, including helping the trees along in what you might call a spiritual or ceremonial way. And that ultimately is what wassailing is all about. And it means, wassail means good health in Old English. And so, or Anglo-Saxon Old English. And so to say wassail to the trees is to wish the trees good health. But this is not purely altruistic, because the healthier the trees are, the more apples there will be and the more cider we'll drink in the dark days of winter, which, as you can see, it's not so dark today, but it will be dark soon, very dark, not far off from the solstice, when pruning is on our minds as well as wassailing. And so wassailing is really an ancient practice, and not just in Britain, several other apple growing regions too. They have traditions for giving thanks to the trees, but especially in the southwest of Britain, the wassail is traditionally done at Epiphany, 12th night. And I usually like to have the trees pruned before I wassail them and toast them, and we'll get to that in a second. But as you can see, the trees aren't pruned, and so usually I hold off wassailing until the trees are pruned. So for me, it's often later than Epiphany. But ultimately, wassailing is something that predates Christianity in Britain and is a very important tradition to me and my family. And it involves giving thanks to the trees and supporting the spirits of the orchard. And the spirits of the orchard actually, in this case, often take the shape of the birds who you can hear and we'll see. And there was a little one who perched in the apple tree here just now. And so one of the things that's done is toast is literally dipped in cider and then hung on the trees. And wassail rhymes are told, and depending on the town or area, different things are said. And one of my favorites is that you put the toast on your tree, you might give a drop of cider to the tree itself, and you say, "Here's to thee, old apple tree, whence mayst thou bud, and whence mayst thou blow? And whence mayst thou give us apples, enow, hats full, caps full, bushel, sacks full, and some for my cider keg too. Huzza!" And then, if we had a musket or some other very loud gun, we'd probably fire it off, and ultimately we're scaring away the bad spirits. But by hanging that little bit of toast in the tree, you're also bringing in the good spirits in the form of the wrens and robins and other little birds that might be about, which, you know, if we're thinking from integrated pest management standpoint, it's probably a great thing to have those little bug-eating birds in the trees at this time of year, and as things proceed into the spring.
Dropping phosphorus on
Dropping
the root
phosphorus
zone,
into the root zone, exactly. So you can see that there probably was more to it than just an excuse to get drunk in the orchard in the middle of the winter, although that was a big part of it too. If we're going to talk about this, we probably should give the trees a wee drop of some cider that we made a number of years ago, and so it's now aged to perfection. But there are many different wassail rhymes that are used, and so that was one of my favorites. But another one of my favorites is "Hold fast root, bear well top, pray give us all a howling big crop, huzzah!" And then a little drop for the trees. And ultimately, that chance to come together in the middle of winter and celebrate around the apple trees, which for so many people, for so many places, and for such a long time, were ultimately the key to life. in a time when the water wasn't necessarily safe to drink and beer was brewed, but when cider apples were available and willing to be pressed, certainly many people were drinking that sweet juice fermented. And so the wassail was a way of people bringing that all around at this time of year and giving thanks to the trees for that sustenance. So especially at this time when people are becoming more conscious about the appropriate use of cultural traditions, this is a very important thing to be bringing out. And I think traditionally the wassail was something that was tied into the respect for the trees and the process of growing fruit. And of course there was celebration involved too, and these things are in many traditional cultures and agricultural ones too intricately linked. You can't really tease them apart. And so although it might be fun and it's something that we do out of joy, the wassail as well is quite a serious undertaking. And I can see how there could be an argument that people today who have as many apples as we want flown in from whatever country we fancy would be doing this purely as an excuse to have some cider, and perhaps might not be doing it in the most appropriate manner. And it's really important that it's done, I think, in good faith. Any type of gardening, if it's not done in good faith, ultimately will not result in good produce. And so that would be one word of warning around it, that these celebrations of the agricultural year are fun, but they have to be done in earnest.
I think one way that we see that is maybe, I mean, there is a tradition and groups of people, the Morris dancers, who, have been carrying this tradition and are fully, in garment and have been, dancing like this for many years and have taken this tradition on.
Yep.
So I think some of the local community groups actually bring them in, and there's a really active group here in Victoria that does wassails with Banfield Orchard and up at Cider, I believe.
Yep.
And so I think...
Yeah, I was there at the first wassail Cider had. Our neighbor used to work with them and found out that I'd just come back from Britain and that I was into this kind of stuff. And so we went out and I helped kind of lead that first one out there, which was great. And I think for many people who are searching for traditions, those traditions that come from our own ancestral pasts are really important. And like I said, many of my ancestors came from Somerset, where they would have been very engaged in that process of wassailing and caring for the trees during the rest of the year. And so it feels to me very authentic, but everyone has to measure that for themselves. And if something doesn't feel authentic, especially when it comes to that reverence that's necessary in something like a wassail, then question it for yourself. I think it's a very important question.